Hello, everyone. My name is Uwe Walter, and I've been a storytelling coach for a long time right now. And my field is media and also business. And today in this video, I would like to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Karen Dietz. She's an excellent, superb consultant in business storytelling since 20 years too. And she has so many skills and achievements in this field of storytelling that I don't know how to mention them all. But let's start with the first one that is quite important. It's the book called Business Storytelling for Dummies. And it's like a library on storytelling. It has so many chapters and knowledge insights, so you can take your whole life to work through it. And it's really an exciting book. She also curated a lot of articles on Scoop It, and probably more than anyone else in the world. You were the president of the National Storytelling Network for some years. And today you support a lot of storytellers around the globe on business storytelling. You help them, you coach them, you make webinars, you give courses, talks, and so on. And you make businesses and organizations more powerful in mastering storytelling for their fields. So my goal in this video is to tell your story, or to listen to your story, to the Karen Dietz journey, the Karen Dietz journey into storytelling. So what is the first thing that comes into your mind now when you look back?
When I look back, well, like most of us, when we think about, well, how did we become who we are today? It's a big story. It's a long story, because where do you start? And it usually starts when you're young, right? And so that's the first place that comes to me, and I grew up with my mom, my dad, and my younger brother, and my dad was a career Army officer. So in the United States, that means that we moved every 1, 2, or 3 years to, various places around the United States, and then over in Germany. We had 2 tours over in Germany. And what I loved about that was learning about so many different cultures. Within the United States, we have many, many different cultures. And then, of course, traveling abroad, it was so eye-opening and magical and wonderful. And I always felt Germany was my true home, interestingly enough. Yeah. And I always felt the most comfortable there. And so what that started me on the path towards was really appreciating different cultures and different traditions that different cultures had. And, you finish school, you go to college, you get a degree, and then I don't know about you, but, I was having identity crisis number, 300 something in my early 20s, because it's like, oh, what am I going to do with my life? And I was stuck in a job that I didn't like, and I would work in the National Park Service on the weekends, and I would lead walks and talks through the historical parts of the park, and I just loved it. So on one of those days when I was having a total meltdown and trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to become, one of the rangers in the park came upon me, and he was doing his best to console me, right? And he said to me, well, Karen, you love doing these walks and talks throughout the park. You love doing the research and finding the stories and sharing the stories. So why don't you go back to graduate school and become a folklorist? And I go, what the heck is that? And he said, well, they go around and they collect stories and songs and traditions. And I go, really? you're kidding me. There's an actual job where someone can go do that. Because another part of my story is when I was younger, I used to play the piano. And one of my favorite songbooks was the Joan Baez songbook of all these old folk tunes. And in the liner notes for each song, there would be something that said, oh, this is a John Jacob. Oh, no. This is a ballad, right? Child ballad, number 300 and something, right? And I go, well, that's kind of interesting. What's a child ballad? It must sound like a collection of ballads. Or it would say John Lomax, collected this song when he was doing research, in the south of the United States. And I go, really? Somebody got to go collect songs, right? And but I thought, this would all happen during the Great Depression in the United States when the government just, made people, here's a job for you. We want you to go collect all the songs, right? And so I didn't think that was happening anymore, right? Until this ranger said, why don't you become a folklorist? And this is what they do. And I go, oh, really? I could go do that? Because when I was reading those liner notes for those songs, I go, God, that would be so great to just travel around with a tape recorder and collect all these songs. I mean, well, that would be the coolest job ever. So as soon as he told me about folklore and what it was all about and what I could do, I made up my mind, that's it. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm going to become. I'm going to be a folklorist. And so I did.
It's interesting that sometimes they are the mentors that recognize or see more in you than you do it at this point in your life.
Yes. And it was so totally by accident. I mean, what a great sort of coming together of influences. And then, wow, that's real. I can do that. So anyway, that's how that's one thread, for, how I came to be who I am today.
Yeah.
And being a folklorist, it was a doctoral program. I only had a bachelor's degree, but I didn't care, right? And I just went. I found the best school that I possibly could and got myself in there. And it was the marvelous, enchanting, incredible experience. And what I learned as a folklorist still informs everything that I do today. So it was a good thing. That was a good move.
It was an establishing ground for you. It's like a landscape, because you started to deeper understand the origins of people, the cultures, the rights, the values. So you created a neural network in your minds and only emotional as well. So, and it was a springboard or jump into the unknown as well, because what will happen when you study this? How can I make money? No idea.
Well, I know my dad, the engineer, right, kept looking at me like, and what can you do with this? And I go, well, I wasn't really sure. I wasn't too worried about it either, but it took him a while, to understand what I was doing. And dads, they love to talk with their colleagues and their friends, and they like to swap stories about what's your kid doing, or this is what my kid is doing. So, he had friends who had sons and daughters who were lawyers and doctors and, engineers. And then they say, well, how's Karen doing? And he'd say, well, she's becoming a folklorist. And they would look at him and kind of go on, what the heck is that? And he'd say, well, do you have about 20 minutes and I'll explain it to you? Because he finally pigeonholed me one day and he says, okay, explain to me what it is you're doing. And it did take 20 minutes for him to, his eyes to finally get big and go, oh, now I understand, right? So that became the big joke. Do you have 20 minutes? I'll tell you.
Yeah. And you started in Wisconsin,
Yes. So
the
both
dairy
my
land, or where
yeah.
people are Catholic or Lutheran and
Mhm.
traditional and family people.
Right. So all of my relatives from my mom's side and my dad's side, lived in Wisconsin, and we would go visit periodically, and a couple times we'd lived there. And I tease everybody. I did not come from a family of storytellers. There's some people in the storytelling community who had amazing aunts, uncles, grandparents, or parents who would just, be amazing storytellers and naturally tell stories. So they were surrounded by stories, all along. Well, in my family, Wisconsin, upper Northwest, Lutherans, Germans, Danish, it's just not so forthcoming and sharing. And so I wasn't really exposed to a lot of really good storytelling when I was growing up. And if storytelling was happening, it was with the parents and, my aunts and uncles, and all of us kids were shooed outside, and they were farmers. They were all farmers. So we would go play on the farm. Right. Uh, and so, yeah, it's just, it was not an experience of just learning naturally about storytelling. And so then when I went into academics to get my doctorate, that's when I learned to become really, really, really boring, right? Because if you ever have listened to academic papers and presentations, they're dense, they're hard to follow, and just boring. And some great ideas embedded in there, but so, and of course, I learned how to speak like that because I was becoming a really good folklorist, right? Um, and then, as a folklorist, of course, stories were a part of what we were learning. And in folklore, there are two main pathways. There's like oral tradition, oral culture, and then there's material culture, art, craft, architecture. The oral is music, song, dance, story, right? And so when I was in graduate school, I didn't really care for the stuff that was happening with story because it seemed just very academic, how to collect stories, how to analyze them, how to preserve them, how to study them. And it was like, well, I don't know. I found it boring, very, very dry, right? Just very dry. So I spent all of my time in material culture looking at art, craft, and architecture because I found that really, really engaging. I loved being able to look across the landscape in the United States and understand, oh, we have this, tradition from German builders. We have English traditions coming in, and they're coexisting side by side on the landscape. That was a lot of fun for me. And I still carry that today, right? When I go into businesses and I look at how the environment is laid out and how that is reflective of the minds who are working there. And it's another whole clue for me as to what's happening in the business. But anyway, that I digress. So it wasn't until a Native American Indian, actually from up in Saskatchewan, Canada, right? He was the keeper of the talking sticks for his tribe. That meant that he held all of the sacred stories. And his name was Ron Evans. And he came into our department one day, and just, a group of us were sitting there chatting, and students, all students. And he said, hey, I'm Ron Evans, and I'm, so-and-so and so-and-so, and I thought you might be interested in what I had to say. So we sat him down, fast and said, yes, please tell us. And that Ron really, he started to share some of his stories, and he rocked my world. I finally stood, oh, this is what storytelling is. This is how powerful it is. This is why I want more of it. Because the experience was so deep and meaningful. And he told the stories in such beautiful ways. And what I experienced as I looked around my fellow students as we were listening to him and he would finish a story, I kept having this experience that we wanted more. Like we were so hungry for these stories. We could have sat there for 2 weeks straight and still not felt fully fed. I'm kind of going, oh, so that's what storytelling really is. And so that's how I got into storytelling. It wasn't, that was the only reason, right?
Wonderful.
But
it's the
it was very
hunger for
profound.
stories.
Mm-hmm.
A hungry for stories, and you couldn't get satisfied. You couldn't be fed. I totally understand. It was.
Yes, you just want more, right?
Yeah.
You just want more. And so, yeah, Ron taught me a lot about stories and storytelling. I consider him my first storytelling teacher. And he would travel. I was in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania getting my doctorate, and he would come in and out of Philadelphia as he was traveling up and down the East Coast of the United States. And whenever he'd come into Philadelphia, I would try to put together a storytelling evening or weekend for him. And so that went on for about 3 years. Really, it was marvelous.
How does he perform storytelling? How does he storytell? What is this way? And do you remember a favorite story?
Well, that's a good question. So let me start with the first part, which is how does he storytell? And then I'll answer the second question if I remember a story. So the way Ron would tell a story, well, first of all, we have to understand his relationship to stories. So in the Native American Indian cultures, at a certain point in your life, at a certain age, right, when you're still young, right, you go on a vision quest to find what your calling is. And Ron went on a vision quest, and his calling was to be the keeper of the sacred stories. And then you go into years and years and years of training on learning those stories. And the sort of relationship to stories, the worldview of stories, is that stories, these are living, breathing beings that just live inside of you. Now, by the time I met Ron, he had maybe 1,000 stories or more that lived inside of him. And then when we were there for, let's say, an evening, or Ron was sharing his stories, he'd sit back in the chair and close his eyes, and we'd sort of wait. And we'd wait. And we'd wait. And finally, Ron's eyes would open up and he'd say, oh, he says, that's the story that wants to be told. And what he was doing is he was sifting through all of the 1,000 stories that lived inside of him and asking. He was doing very, very deep listening. He was asking the stories, which one wants to be told now? At this space and this time with these people. Because his philosophy is that there's something that people need to hear when they congregate together to listen to stories. So what is it? What does this audience need now from me, right? or from the story, the land, the world of story. And so he would deep listen inside for that story that needs to be told. And then when he got it, it's like, oh yeah, I understand now, right? Then he would share that story with us. And then when he ended, he would share a little something about the story because, these were sacred stories from his tribal tradition. And so sometimes they would need a little, context around them so that we could more fully understand and appreciate the story. And then when he was done, he'd just go back, lay back in his chair, close his eyes, and we would wait. We would wait another minute or two, and then he'd say, oh, yeah, that's the story that wants to be told. And then he would tell the next one. And that is how the whole evening went. And we were just entranced. Well, first of all, we felt like, oh, he's telling stories that we need to hear. We as a special group, right? No other time will we come together in exactly this space, this time, with these exact people. And so it's like, oh, so what do we need to hear as we congregate together as a group? There's nothing more magical than that. And so that was really, really significant, I think, because what he was teaching me was how to listen to the audience and how to listen for the story to find the match. Now, there's one thing that happens in Ron's culture of storytelling, which is that the story needs to be told exactly the same way every single time. So there are pauses, voice inflections, turns of phrase that have to be identical. So this is your covenant with the story to be told the way the story wants to be told, right? The way it must be told, because there's something in the structure, in the tonality, in the vocalization of the story that must be preserved to be in good faith with the story, to have be in good relationship with that story. Because as a living, breathing being that's living inside of you, it demands deep respect and a deep relationship that you have with each story. Right? So now for us in our tradition, not so much, right? We'll tell the story. A story will shift and change depending on the audience we're with. For some people, it's no, we actually have to tell the story the exact same way every single time, right? But there's not that so much maybe that level of relationship or sacredness to the story. So sometimes I've seen performers where I've heard the story once, twice, 3 times, and it's exactly the same. And I'm kind of going, I didn't get anything new out of that story, right? So there's something here about the relationship between the storyteller and the story that I really honor with Ron, right? Because I know the difference. I've experienced the difference. And so
I think it's an aura around the moment to find the right story in the right moment for the right audience, and to perform it like kind of a song, with a structure that has to be repeated. On one hand side, it's erratic, it's unique. You only tell the story probably once in your life, but you have a kind of a form that is very important to transport this story, a kind of vocalization, pauses, and all this stuff. So that's very interesting, because I think it's totally different to our view, because we make movies, where we fix the story. And I think in their idea, or in Ron's idea, you don't fix it. You have to transport it orally, and you have to find the right match, the right moment, the right magic for the right audience. That's something we can grab. It's totally different to our understanding of culture, because we would like to fix it and make it, printed copy and send it to millions. Yeah.
Right. So this is something very different, because the relationship with the teller and the audience is really important too. So you have like a triangle: the relationship to the storyteller, the storyteller to the audience and the audience to the story, right? And so this is a dynamic, right, that of experience that we pay attention to. And now, now this is traditional storytelling. And what I love about what Ron told me is that I understand the roots of that deep sacred tradition. And I understand business storytelling, right? And sometimes they go like this. But when I coach people, I get to coach them to the ideal. The ideal being, well, what does your audience need? Not what you need to tell, right? Do you thinking, Mr. Leader, oh, I need to tell them this, right? No, what do they need to hear? And if we can start from there, we have a better experience. And so that's one little translation, that I do in my own work from what I learned from Ron. And what I've adapted from Ron is, yes, there is a particular way to tell a story, but that in our Western culture and tradition, we have to have the fluidity to be able to tell it, and so I honor both traditions. And so I think what happens in business, I've had so many leaders say to me, okay, let's get this story down, we'll videotape it, and then I won't have to tell it again. And so it's sort of like a movie, but a movie is an artistic expression too. So we need to add that into our Western tradition, right? That this kind of narrative product, right, is an artistic creative form that has many artistic creative norms and values and processes that go into it. So I don't want to discount it in any way. It's just different, right? And but I always ask, I was sort of kind of wonder, okay, so what can we learn from the traditional storytelling, right, that we can bring into movies? And I do think that there's something that goes on in the movie crafting business, that there's a relationship that the artist has with the story they're trying to express, and learning how to express. So how does this story need to be told? How does it want to be told now? Right? So that's what I'm hoping goes on. What do you think?
Yeah. And when you think at the stories, that is there one story or a fragment of a story that you might remember when you think at Ron? Or because like a fluid, you digested the stories. They came into your body, into your soul, you digested them. So probably you forgot them, but they did their job because they are living. So is there a story that you remember, a fragment or an idea or something that you have in mind when you think at Ron's stories?
Well,
or a story that resonates or had a rapport to your situation at that time?
Well, I have two ways of answering that question. One is that I don't remember a specific story. I remember stories about Isak, who's the creator, and the trickster, right? So those were very funny stories, and their purpose was to sort of poke funs at arrogance and hubris and things of that sort. I don't tell any of those stories. I never even tried to remember them because in Ron's world, I would have to have permission to tell those stories. And then I would have to learn those stories the way they wanted to be told. And so there would be a passing along of tradition, not just the story. And so those were Ron's stories that he had permission to tell from the stories themselves, and I had none of that. So it would be a deep breach right? To even, contemplate, well, let me try to tell this story that Ron just told, right? It would be a bastardization, right? The story. But there was another experience that I had with Ron. We were down at the International Storytelling Festival in Jonesborough, Tennessee, in one of the early days. And this is where, 10,000 people would come descend on this little town, to hear stories for 2.5, 3 days. And Ron was asked to perform at that festival. This is where all the top storytellers from across the nation would come and be together and perform. Keeping this tradition of storytelling live storytelling, alive. So Ron was telling stories in a small, an old kitchen of a farmhouse in town. And there must have been 30 or 35 of us listening to his stories, because they would have small venues and then they have the big tent venues. So you had a lot of different opportunities. And Ron was telling stories, and it was great. And then he told a story. It was a very short story about how the grandmothers created man and woman. And by the time he was done, every single one of us, was openly weeping. Just weeping. And it wasn't because it was a sad story at all. It was because Ron told it with such beauty. Such beauty, he told that story. It made us weep. So the storytelling session ended. We went about our ways to go listen to the next round of stories wherever, right? We had a bunch of choices to choose from. And maybe about 30 minutes or an hour later, it's probably an hour later, I'm on the streets of Jonesborough looking for my next, storytelling session that I was going to. And I saw Ron on the street. He was sitting on a bench and he was just sobbing, just racked with sobs, these deep, deep hurts, right? Just sobbing in despair. And I sat down and I said, Ron, what's wrong? And he said, that story of the grandmothers that I shared? I go, yes. He says, one of the people in the room asked me if she could write that story down, because she's writing a children's book and she wanted it for the children's book. And Ron said, no. And she said, please. He said, no. She kept after him. He said, no. She kept after him. He said, no. Finally, he broke down. And he says, okay, I'll tell you the story. And as he told the story, she wrote it down. And with her last pen stroke, when she finished writing it down, he all of a sudden knew the horror of what he had done. Because in his world, story is always oral. Because there's something that happens between the teller, the story, and the audience. And in our Western culture, we write things down, right? But then it becomes like concrete. The words, they never change. And for him, he was like, oh my God, I've just done a terrible, horrible thing, and I have broken faith with that story. And he was so horrified by what he'd done. And so it goes beyond sad, right? When I say he was so sad about what he'd done, it's like an understatement. Because he said to me in his grief, it was total grief. He said to me, I don't know if I will ever be able to tell that story again. Because that story was so upset with him, and he had broken faith with that story. So that taught me a lot too about stories, about the various forms we put stories in, about the difference between his culture and our culture. But again, this deep honoring and respect and relationship we have with the story. Now, I don't advocate that in our Western culture, that we don't write things down, but I do always question when I work with a leader or a company, do you really need to write it down, or is it better orally? Your first impulse is to write it down so that you can share it, but it loses something. So if you're looking for maximum impact and maximum leverage, why would you write it down? And I understand there are times when you need to write it down. Right? But as a default, sort of knee-jerk reaction from us, so let's write it down, right? When actually that might be the last thing that you would want to do. So that's my story about a story that Ron told.
Yeah, it creates rapport in me concerning, or a reflection that in companies or even in our family, the question is, when do you have time to share a story? When do you have this neural coupling, the brain coupling? Right. When are you at the same time in the same room, or even if it's remote, but when do you orally, share the story? And I have seminars right now where I meet the managing directing people of the company, the C group, and we sit together for 2 days. We just tell the story of the company, the story of the people there.
I love that.
And it's magic. It's magic pure. The people afterwards, we knew each other since years, but we never had the time to tell each other who we are, what we feel, what we suffer, what our dream is. And I think this is really so magic. And it reminds me when you tell this with Ron, how important this oral storytelling is. Because if we would write it down and put it on a website or on a PDF, it doesn't have the same change, and the same impact in your life. There's something totally magic for me. And people say in the beginning, we don't have time for 2 days to talk with each other. I'm the CEO here in the company. We have to run a company, for a worldwide company. Say, no, we have to take the time to listen to each other. If we don't know each other, if we don't trust each other, if we don't know the story, if we don't cry together, if we don't laugh together, we're not a team. We're not a soul. We're not linked to each other. So I think that's so this reminds me when you tell about this event, in with Ron, where he had a kind of a trauma. It's a trauma that he suffered then.
Very, very deep trauma. And that's why I say Ron taught me a lot about the care and feeding of stories. And we sometimes think, I've got stories I could tell. And some I like to tell more than others. But am I really focused on the relationship that I have with the story? Am I really focused on treating that story with honor and respect? It goes way beyond just, this story is one of mine and I appreciate it. It has, well, see, now the other thing that Ron told me is that every story that you tell has work to do in the world. And your job is to not question that. So if a story comes to you and it keeps knocking at you, tell me, right? You just tell it. You don't try to figure out why or where or when, right? You just tell it. And you give up that control that you want over the story. And you just honor that story, whatever needs to be told at that particular time. And so that was also, a really important principle, I think, for me. Again, goes back to the deep listening. I think deep listening for stories is a critical skill to build.
Yeah, what you mentioned with listening delightedly, these really being open-minded, like when you drink or you breath fresh air, that you try to be like a child, open-minded with any prejudice, just listen, let it do the job.
Right. And be willing to change, be changed by whatever you hear. And I learned that technique, not from Ron, but from another storytelling teacher of mine, Doug Lippman. And he has this, whole process that he does in his story coaching. It's been revolutionary, for so many of us in the story world, how to really listen, how to ask reflective questions afterwards so that you pull more meaning out of the story. And that helps both you and also helps the storyteller understand more deeply about their story. And then just giving appreciations afterwards for all the things that were going right. Because when you hear that story again, you want more of what's going right? So often when we hear a story, we just jump on, oh, well, if you told it this way, it'd be better, right? We give that criticism, but then creativity, just really plummets down, to the ground. And we've undermined the person telling the story. We've robbed them of some of their power, right? By saying, oh, no, really, you should do it this way, right? No, it's their story to tell. They have to figure out what works best for them because they have to honor the story in the way it wants to be told. And it's their story, by the way, not yours. So, every time you do that, tell it this way because it'd be better, then you rob them of their own power and their own agency over their own story. And so that's something that's really, really important for me to never, ever do. I try my best to not do that when I'm coaching somebody, because every time I do that, I chip away at their confidence. And what do they need to be when they're up on stage, in front of an all-hands company-wide meeting as the leader? They need to have supreme confidence. So why would I undermine that? Okay, that's my soapbox.
Wow, so exciting. And Joseph Campbell mentioned the idea of Sat Chit Ananda in Hinduism, and it's being, it's a reflection, and it's getting to your bliss. So without reflection, you don't learn so much. So the reflection process, what does it do with you? And then how do you find yourself in their own rapport, the life that wants to come out, like the vision dream that Ron had, this in your childhood, connected with your vision dream, connected with your path, your journey. So we all have different journeys. Even we want to copy it sometimes. Say, oh, I would like to have the journey of Karen or somebody else. No, you will never have it. That's life.
And I think all of us storytellers have been in the middle of telling a story. And because we're deep listening to the story and our audience all at the same time, we might have an experience right when we're telling the story of, oh, now I know what that story is really about. So that self-reflection happens in real time sometimes. And it's just, sometimes it's like just by telling the story, we have a new understanding of it, which I think is, again, a little piece of magic that happens.
And sometimes if you think you know exactly what it does and what the essence of the story is for you might be wrong, probably.
Well,
sometimes
yes.
it takes weeks or months to really learn what was the story behind the curtain, or the first success or the first result you saw.
And sometimes, we're a different person today than we were a month ago. And so when we tell that story, we might, today, for who I am today, and I have a little more understanding about that story. And there's some stories that I have that I don't tell because I still haven't figured out what the point of the story is. They're great stories, right? But it's like, so when would I tell that story, and what's the point I want to make of it? How would I make it relevant to the audience? So anyway, that's just kind of interesting. And
I
there you
enjoy
go.
every second of your telling. It's awesome. Yeah. And the question that I have right now is, because we're already 50 minutes, or let's say, I don't know exactly,
Right.
probably more than 40 minutes into our talk or in our video. My planning was to go into the journey and go a step further than that, because you
Yes.
started in the university. You had this appointment, this meeting, several meetings with Ron, and then you had to leave the university. You have to leave college. And as far as I know, for every one of us, it's a huge thing, to leave the college, the warmth, the alma mater, and find your path in the world. Find a place where you can be useful and where you find something to being useful, but at the same time, be happy with yourself. So how did you start after university? How did you find your way into your storytelling calling, into your storytelling path?
Well, I didn't really think academic path was in my future. I just didn't like it as a profession well enough. But I did like teaching. And so I thought, okay, I'm leaving the university. I'm going out into the big wide world. So what skills do I have that are transferable? And I said, oh, maybe teaching, but not teaching academically, but more like training, right? And with individuals and with companies. And so I got hooked up with a training company that did trainings, all over the globe. And I brought those trainings into Philadelphia, and then had to fill those seats, put butts in seats. And that's what they call it here in the US. And so I did that for, 4 years, and shocked myself how successful I was. And because here I don't know anything about business. And so I had to learn the hard way, the school of hard knocks, what worked and what didn't work. I made a lot of mistakes. I was scared witless. I was so scared about what I was doing. I thought for sure I was going to end up on the streets as a homeless person. But none of that happened. And actually, I was pretty successful. And so successful, I was able to bring a partner in after a year and a half. So we, did this together. Eventually, I sold the company to my partner because I was tired of living in Philadelphia and I wanted to move someplace else. And so that place ended up being California, where I found another job as a training director for a big real estate company. So I moved out to California and I did that job for a little while, and then eventually moved over into consulting. So consulting, training, that was my path. Now, in all of that journey, folklore, storytelling, all of that took a back seat because it had absolutely no relevance, right? And yet I took all of my skills and was using my skills all of the time, but I couldn't tell anybody I was a folklorist or that I was really into storytelling, because they would look at me like, what, you tell stories to kids in the library on Saturday afternoon? No, I didn't get my doctorate in that, right? And so it's important. Yeah, as important as that is.
Yeah, you become an undercover. You told me, an undercover storyteller. You couldn't say loudly aloud, what your mission is,
Because if I mentioned any of that stuff, I wouldn't get work, right? They wouldn't hire me. I wouldn't get paid. So that went on for a number of years, probably 7, 8, 9 years, until the year 2000 happened. And I was working with big banks on Wall Street as a consultant. And I started to hear my executives talk about, maybe we should start thinking about the story we need to tell. Because the articles are being written now in the business magazines about, hey, storytelling could be, really important. And a couple colleagues ended up writing books about the importance of storytelling that took off like wildfire. And once I heard my executives start mentioning the word story and storytelling, I go, maybe it's time to come out of the closet and really leverage my skills in storytelling, my skills as a folklorist, my skills working in organizations at a senior level. And so that's what I did. I said, I'm going to reinvent myself. It seems like the time is right. And so I declared myself a business storytelling professional back then. And I've never looked back. And that has been a wonderful journey.
Wow. And then you started to become a freelance then, or how did it really came out? Yeah.
Yes,
so
I went freelance. And so on my own. And
so you had to find clients, customers, and establish a program or services that you can help. How did that start? What was your first job, as a consultant then?
My first contract as a consultant was with a startup company, technology company here in San Diego that needed to raise seed money to keep its operations going. And so I'd been around business enough, and I knew they needed offering documents. They knew they needed offering documents, but these are a bunch of engineers. Right? You can imagine what they focused on, what they thought was important, which was all of the details and information and not what it could do for people, right? And so they hired me to work on their offering documents to tell the story really well in their offering documents, and then to help them share the story when they were doing the presentations and making the pitches, right? And to work with the staff also in helping them come up, well, what is a story that we want to tell? So it was a group effort, company-wide effort, because it would never really work if the executive was out there telling one thing, right? And all the workers are, saying something different. So you're small enough, let's get congruent, right? Let's make sure everything matches, like the work that you do, Uwe. And so we did. And it was very successful, right? They raised, over $1 million in seed money, and that got them started. And then their future unfolded, right? So I'm kind of going, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that experience. And then, I got referred to other senior vice presidents who were launching global projects and needed help, getting people on board. What's the stories we need to tell and listen to? So everybody's a part of the project, and resistance kind of starts decreasing, and we have alignment, around that. And then, there are other projects of going and collecting customer stories, for big companies so that they could understand, are those experiences, do they match with what we say our marketing is? Right. And if so, Yahoo. And if not, how do we, what do we need to do to make sure their experience is reflected, right, in our marketing? But all of that was really brilliant. Good for them as a company doing that. So these are just some of the projects that I've had. So I've had consulting projects, and I've had a lot of one-on-one or small group coaching projects over the years. So it's been a mix, right?
How did you get in touch then with the National Storytelling Network? How does it happen? Because on one hand side, you worked with for customers, for clients. On the other hand, you learned, you studied, you did networking, you build up a community around in the storytelling field. How did you come in touch with National Storytelling Network then?
Well, I think for all of us, various times in our lives, we're looking at the work that we're doing and we start getting a little dissatisfied. Like, this work isn't calling to me like it used to. Maybe my work is shifting and changing. Maybe, there's some other opportunity out there that I need to pay attention to. And the National Storytelling Network, which I was a member, they were saying, "Oh, right, we're looking for a new executive director." And I go, "Well, now that's kind of interesting." So I knew a couple of the board members, and so I would ask the board member, "Tell me a little bit more about this." And they say, "Oh, Karen, you should apply. We would love to have you apply." And I'm kind of going, that would be really quite a course change, for me. But it kept calling to me. And I said, "Oh, shoot, why not?" Right? So I applied and, went through the whole interview process. And there I found myself, as their next executive director, which I did for a few years. And so again, that was in a really incredible experience. I learned so much from doing that, and eternally grateful for that opportunity. And so, and then things shifted again, right? As life does, right? And so I left the network and sort of explored a few other things, eventually built back my practice up again. And, but here, I think what I learned in my work at that network really helped me be even better, in the business world. So, I was bringing a lot to the network from the business world, and I learned a lot there. And anyway, so it was I think we had some good results when I was working there, and I learned a lot. So it was a good experience. So there you go. And so then I came back, and my work changed a little bit more, and that's I ended up being curating all of those articles, 2,000 plus articles, all reviewed, the best I can find in business storytelling, with very good practical advice. Those articles are still valid. They're still out there. They're still searchable, right? And you can go on to my curation and learn a lot. And the book came to me as a result of that. The TEDx talk came, and so that was really a magical time also. So.
Yeah, and when I remember our conversations, it's always, you have a great depth in deep, you're very deep into all fields of storytelling. Even the book that you wrote with Lori, the business storytelling dummy book, it's astonishing how probably a part of your calling is really being a kind of a mentor or a teacher for everybody. Because I'm following a lot of talks right now on LinkedIn Live and other webinars with you. And it's always extremely interesting because I don't know anybody else who has such a wide and deep knowledge on storytelling, because you love it it's like a huge library in your head and in your soul. You love all the facets of the diamond, of the storytelling. And yeah.
Yeah, I attribute that to my folklore training. Folklore as a discipline in the United States is composed of so many different pieces. Like, sure, we have our own body of knowledge and research, right, that we've done over the years. And in Germany, you have an even deeper tradition of folklore and Volkskunde. But still, with that, our class at the University of Pennsylvania in the folklore department took other classes in other departments: anthropology, communication, geography, American history, sociolinguistics. Did I mention psychology? Sociology, right? So we're very broad, right, in our training and our worldviews and what makes up folklore. And so that's one reason I like folklore, is because it's so eclectic. It's so, so many other fields we can investigate and bring that knowledge into our understanding of folklore. And so I think that I'm just wired that way to always, be interested in what's going on in the gaming field. What are they learning that we can bring into storytelling? What's happening around, since my background is around architecture and analysis of the social use of space, how does storytelling and the worldviews that we have about, in our heads also get reflected in the spatial environment, in the built environment? What are those buildings and the way they're laid out across the landscape or in a city? What do they tell us? What story are they telling us, right? So this is like play, right? Because you get to sort of play with all of these different fields and understand, and I think Lori, as my co-author with Business Storytelling for Dummies, and she brought some really solid perspectives into the book. She wrote that whole chapter on sales. She did she did a few of the chapters, and so she was a lifesaver for me, and it was a good collaboration together. And I would write, and she would massage and add and fix, and then we would agree on the chapter, and then we would turn it into the publisher. And sometimes she would take the lead on a chapter, and then I would read and add and fix. So it was a nice back and forth between us, right? And it worked really well. But I think that also contributed, right, to the depth of the book. And we wanted to make sure that we covered a broad range of topics because it had to be applicable to anybody in business. So are you a salesperson? Well, you're going to look at the book through the view of a salesperson or a sales leader, and how can I use stories? But if you are in training or organizational development or leadership, then you're going to want to know different things, right? So we wanted to make sure that in the book we covered, right, the basics of business storytelling in all of the different ways it could be applied, and tried to do it and give very practical, right, steps to take.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's also kind of a taxonomy because there are so many fields. So you can, for every field, marketing, storytelling, change management, leadership, you find own chapters with an own structure, and that's very important. So for me, that's lays the ground. It's like a world map, world map of storytelling, and that's a wonderful piece. And I think you match wonderfully with Lori. It's a great gift, you both together. So
great. Thank you.
Campbell Haven would say, there's the sense makes sense mandate, and for me, you are a kind of a scientist in storytelling, too. because you always wonder, how does it work? What are the elements? What is, it's you're still the folklorist. So you are a doctor in storytelling. So it's probably it's a kind of a vocation. Yeah. It's beautifully. Yeah. So
thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for this contribution to our world and the world that I can share. And that leads us to the situation today. Storytelling. When you look at the situation today, the world, the leadership, the politics, the crisis, from climate crisis or global warming to the virus, to economic challenges, to financial topics, to there are so many things, and we as people, we have to make sense of all of that. We have to find our stories. We have to find our understanding, our role in the world. So what do you think about the situation, or how does it resonate with your thinking, your reflection? How does it?
Well, I think in a few ways. First of all, I asked myself, well, what are the stories people need to hear right now to help them through this? And I think we all need stories of hope and reassurance and stories to build trust, right? So that's the most immediate need. And then I asked, my philosophy, my point of view, how I try to live my life is, yes, and so the stories we tell ourselves now will create our future. So we have to be very, very deliberate about the stories we're sharing today. And, we, for quite a while now, our culture has really enjoyed apocalyptic stories. Dystopian, very dark. Well, that's what we're feeding ourselves. And our minds get attuned to that, and then that's the reality that we create for ourselves. So here we are in a place where we need to be very conscious of the choices we're making around the stories that we're telling. Because the stories will create our future. And do we want to ingest a bunch of junk food stories that may, alleviate a temporary anxiety or concern for us? Or do we want to deliberately tell stories that actually nourish us for the long term? Like a diet of potato chips is not going to make you healthy. And a diet of dystopian stories isn't going to help you very much, right? So it's like learning to shift, to stories that do enliven us, nourish us, feed our souls, keep us going, right? That's that hunger that we're craving that was happening when Ron was telling his stories. That's how hungry we were. And we weren't even in a time that was, when we look back on those years, it was like, oh, that was a pretty good time, right? Compared to what we have today, right? But if we were hungry then, you can bet we're hungry now. And so it's learning what stories to tell now. And as leaders, right, through this time of crisis and change, which will be continuing for a while. I mean, change here, we are radically changing, right? So many parts of our lives, and some will go back to quote unquote normal, but I think it's going to be the new normal. So what stories do we need to be telling ourselves? And as leaders, we need to learn which story to tell at the right time, depending on where we are in that cycle of change. So which phase of the change cycle are we in? And knowing that, right, then I know the stories I need to listen for, the stories I need to tell, right? And that way, I have more certainty as a leader in very uncertain times. And so I don't know. I think I answered your question. Ask me another question if I didn't.
No, I remember a word that you said. It's on one hand side, it's a question what leaders tell as stories. On the other hand, it's we need story gatherings. You mentioned it somewhere else. We need story gatherings that we come together and share stories. It's not only storytelling. It's also gathering and listening. And it's also, this is conversational storytelling. So we start to tell stories each other and we grow. So we would need now spaces, I don't know, remote or analog, but we need spaces where we consider the kind of future in which we want to live in. Because some philosophers say, now we have opportunities to change and find new ways of living. But
right.
Where is the marketplace to share this? Where is the campfire? Do we have time to talk? Because now we are in the amygdala system. So very often in a kind of a panic or fear, and people want to protect. But if you want to protect and you're scared, you're probably not in the mindset of really going out, to the prefrontal cortex or other brain areas where you can create future and new words and a new language and a corporate or conversational idea of how you want to live. So I think
I have two thoughts on that. One is that all of us as individuals are very powerful because we have social connections. We may not be able to physically be with somebody right now, but we have experiences like this. And we have our own spheres of influence. If your only area of influence is your immediate family, well, dang, tell stories, right, that enliven your family. If you have other connections out in the community, then be that beacon of light. Be that person who tells stories that are hopeful, that give us a reassurance, that show us creative solutions that other people have come up with, right? Do that, right? So as individuals, we do have enormous areas of influence that we can deliberately, consciously affect in positive ways, right? So my one response is, well, go get busy, right? Do that. And then when we talk about business, right, then it's also, I think there's a great opportunity for businesses because they are already groups of people who've come together, right, to work together. Now, whether you are an individual with your sphere of influence or you're a company with your own sphere of influence and employees and things, the first thing that I always encourage people to do is don't tell, listen. And listen for the stories that people are telling you. Let them tell your stories, because what do people want? We want to be seen, heard, and valued. And there's no more powerful way to do that than to just listen to somebody's story. Tell me how you're doing. What's going on for you? And then if there's a story you can tell in return to help them, yay, great. But sometimes it's just listening and that's enough. And then if you listen to enough people, you start getting a collective understanding of the story. And then you can respond, right? Oh, hey, I heard this little story. I understand. I get, I heard that story from all of these people. Here's, a story it sparks in me, right? And to share that story. Because storytelling is like this, right? We influence each other back and forth. But if we're not willing to listen to the stories of others, well, we've lost half the magic. And because I think there's actually more magic in listening than there is in telling.
I think this is probably the best final word, because when I read your book, The Business Storytelling for Dummies, my first and extremely important understanding was the recognition or the rapport that I had in myself when you said storytelling is 80% story listening. It's 80%. And I was shocked. It was like, yes. It's in my marriage. So it's in every job that I have with my family. In my country, it's listening. And I think that's a fantastic idea that you spread with your word and with your book. And
thank you.
So do you have something to add, or is that, for me, that would be a wonderful ending here, or, an outview for the world?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Let's just leave it there, Good.